We're on Friday. It must be about May the 27th of 2016, and we're going to be talking with Jane Curtis this morning about a person I don't think many of us have heard of, Ethelred the Unready. Mm-hmm. You want to explain him?
Well, I had the impression that maybe people of our vintage had heard the name, but that was it. And maybe some kind of flighty guy from the past. But Ethelred the Unready, first of all, let me explain about the term unready, because Ethelred, now he really would have been Ethelred, would have been pronounced that way. And the red part of it means counsel or advice. And unred means that poor, no advice at all, or poor advice, poor counselors. And that was the case with Ethelred, because he was not the brightest person in the world, you know, not the snappy military commander or anything like that. But he came from a long line of Saxon kings, and I don't know why in subsequent years the English didn't count that as part of their long train, because they were the entire Saxon, a couple of hundred years, over 200 years of it. Mm-hmm. But it started out in the year 820 when a certain Ecgbrecht, and Ecgbrecht had, he was a king of Kent. He had inherited the kingdom of Kent in 802, but he was exiled. They were all fighting with, there was a lot of petty kings down there. And he won out, and it was the first time there was really more or less a united country there, and not counting Scotland, up to about Hadrian's Wall, because the Romans, of course, had been there for a long time, but they don't count since they were just a province of Rome. But down through the years, it was just about that time, just about in 800, when the Vikings began their vicious marauding.
Oh, okay.
And after a few seasons, a lot of them stayed over. But it started then, so there was a constant fight with these people who were partly Celtic and, of course, Roman influenced, and with all of these Angles and Saxons having moved in from the continent, flowed in. So you had this kind of mixed society going on, and the kings at each other. But what happened then was that people were killed all the time, of course. His son had a number of children, and the one daughter who married well and sort of helped, get the alliances get together, but several sons, and they were just picked off one by one, fighting the Danes, until it finally got down to Ethelred the First. There was another Ethelred. Okay. And the youngest of all, Alfred, who became known as Alfred the Great. But Alfred fought the Danes like everybody else. He worked hard at it. He was more of a religious bent. But his son Edward then had a son who continued fighting the Danes and continued this the religion. They were all Catholic at this point. They had all been converted. And eventually it wound up with a certain Edgar, known as Edgar the Peaceful. And Edgar the Peaceful had two sons. He had two wives. The first wife died and the second wife came on. Each one of them had a son and some other children. But the first one became king then when Edgar died fairly young. 10-year-old boy called Edward, later on called the Martyr. So you can imagine what happened to him. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of stories about, was it the mother of the second son, Ethelred, who became Ethelred II, who engineered this death, or was it somebody else? There was a lot of other politics going on. So as little Ethelred grew up then, this was this atmosphere that had been there for a long time. There's a severe threat from the outside and machinations going on the inside. And if we could please look at a couple of pictures, the first couple of pictures here. This represents Ethelred sitting on the throne. It is probably a couple of hundred years later, but close enough that it's, maybe a fairly close. The clothing certainly would be real. The next one, please, will show us a coin minted in his day. And if that doesn't look like an Indian chief with a fancy feather headdress, But you can see written around it on the side. On the left there is Ethelred, and then at the top, it's kind of smooshed a little bit there. But Ethelred Rex, Ethelred the king. So this actually came out in his day. And it's not a flattering portrait, but maybe that's really what he looked like. Who knows? But there's one more, the next picture. This was a gold coin, known as a minkus or a mangus, whatever, a gold coin. And again, you can pick out Ethelred on the left and Rex at the top, Ethelred the king. And this one is probably more like what he really looked like. But it's somewhat similar. He has the same kind of firm nose there and small mouth, and he's in armor. So I don't know how much fighting he ever had to do. Some, of course, because he became king in 978, and it was still going at it hot and heavy in those days. But you get a picture of there really was such a person as Ethelred. He married, had some children, and in the year 1002, he did a very foolish thing. It showed that he'd been born in the 60s, so he was a man in his 40s. He was a mature man by this time. But what he did was just suddenly, overnight, like that, send out his soldiers and massacre every Dane they could find.
Oh.
This, of course, was a very foolish thing to do because the Danish were very powerful.
Yes.
But it was about 10 years before they really got revenge for it. But that happened, and in the same year, perhaps not by accident, he married a lady named Emma of Normandy. And Emma was the daughter of the ruler of Normandy, which was a sort of separate preserve in France. The French, they were a handful. They had come down with Rollo. She was the great-granddaughter of the founder. And when she married Ethelred, she brought a certain amount of pedigree as far as the Scandinavians went. But she also theoretically brought a powerful ally, but that didn't happen because they still let the Danish raiders, the Viking raiders, come over and have bases on the coast there in Normandy. Mm-hmm. So again, Ethelred is in the midst of an uncomfortable type situation. And that reaction, that strong reaction to kill everybody, which he could do, of course, because he was king, his word was law.
Sure, he could kill anybody he wanted to.
May explain some of that. But at any rate, he remained, well, before we leave the Danes in that particular period, there was a religious upswing because of all this terrible marauding and vicious things that they did. Fire, the sword, raping, stealing, just wanton killing. They're not nice people, and making fun of it too. Mm-hmm. The primary preacher of the day was a man named Bishop Wulfila, and Wulfila's sermons, hellfire, brimstone, the whole bit, holy rollers and that, just everything. Wulfila made a series of sermons over the years, and they exist. The text still exists. In fact, I have a book in which they're all printed, and they are really fun reading. And it's very good for learning a language because they repeat so many words. Uh-huh. But onto this confused background, we have then this religious fervor sort of thing, and we have, I'm going to read this to you. You're free. You're going to hear what Old English sounded like, okay, and what they would be speaking to each other. No extra charge. And he starts out saying, Leven men, and this means dearly beloved. Leven men, kleine westes earthe, onhöre frum schärfte, ak wei habe sudan, a fool at a swither. And mit orum sunum, with our sins, with orum sunum, fair besmittene, says here, for thamthe we, nelleth godeslag je helden, swaswa we sholden. So this violent stuff is going on, and in the local language, not in Latin. The bishop, of course, was used to operating in Latin, but this came out, and the people were frightened by all of this, and they did feel sinful. On the other hand, you could see from those coins, the country was reasonably prosperous. And the Danes didn't get far enough inland that they completely destroyed all the crops. So the country was not too bad off. Alfred, in fact, way back in the 800s, had bought the Danes off for a while by paying them and saying, you go over there in the east of England, East Anglia, and you stay there and you don't maraud on us, and we'll give you whatever it was, silver and gold. So that, again, another part of this very confused and indecisive. You can see why he might have been decisive, not knowing which way to jump next on some of this. But by the time the year 1013 rolled around, a certain Svein was king of Denmark, and Denmark and Norway were sort of interchangeable, and that they fought each other hard, but whichever one won, got to any given battle, would be taking over as king of both. So here was Svein, and he took a big army and or ships, and they sailed over to the Humber estuary and up the estuary, and they fought their way right down through England, and they got to London, and as they were taking London, Ethelred and his family and his court fled. Off across the channel they went. And let us please see picture. I think that is picture, no, well, let's look at picture 3 anyway. That is, the first one is one of the battles, the Battle of Maldon. That was a famous one. This obviously is an artist's conception later, but it was fought on, partly on the causeway there. And the Danes, the villains, asked the English king, was somebody named Bertnoth, or the general, please let us come across the causeway so we can really fight, because this was a tidal backwater. And the silly Englishman said, or Saxon said, sure, come on across. And they were trounced. And that was part of the reason why the Danes could get down there. But the next picture, then, we see again, an artist's representation, but it does represent the fact that they rooted them out, everyone they could find, regardless. And then the next picture there after that will show us, again, we skipped one before that. Yeah, they had to take ship, of course, and they rowed out and took one of their Viking-type ships. They all used that type ship in the old days. Now, the next picture we'll look at now, this represents the lady I mentioned, Queen Emma, who became Queen Emma. And she's identified on a lot of these pictures. She was given a Saxon name, which was Algifu, noble gift. And that's on there. The A-E and the G-U are on the left, or G-Y are on the left, and over there, Regina, Queen. So they didn't leave you any doubt. This is one that is likely to be closer to an original period piece. But the next picture shows her again. She put out a book. This book was actually published in one of the best sources on that period, because she went into her relations with the country, her activity. She was very active. She was like a president's wife who takes a hold, and gets things of her own to work on. But you can see it. The picture there shows some of the fields in which she participated, religion and other things there. I don't think we want to look at another one quite yet. Yeah, so her book didn't come out actually till later. But the court had fled then. Here it is toward the end of the year 1013, 1,000 years ago. And they're over in France. Well, Svein Forkbeard up and died. He had fought his way through, and he was actually, I guess, sort of anointed king of England, or accepted anywhere within this circle. And he had surmounted a lot of odds to do that, because one of his rivals, the Norwegian court, Olaf Haraldsson. Olaf was a young man and adventurer, and he had come down with a fleet from the Norway side of Scandinavia and gone up the Thames, and he was going to help Ethelred against the other Scandinavian.
Okay.
And it's very clever. Well, what he did, the tide was rising, and what they did, he took his ships up and he said, now everybody get under your shields or whatever you can do, and they must have had rope with them, and reasonably strong rope. But they got up to the bridge. London Bridge at that time was very long, of course, but flimsy, and it was only on piles. And the Danes, of course, had fortified it. The Danes were all out there with their weapons, and they built a couple of towers, that they could shoot arrows from, all kinds. So the Norwegians come by in these ships, huddling under their things, and they somehow get these ropes around the pilings. Now, meanwhile, they're sailing, and the tide is rising, and I understand the tide rises rather fast in that area. So the next thing you know, the pilings were taken right out under London Bridge, and all the Danes were tossed into the water. So the Danes didn't have it easy winning England, but they did. But then Svein died in 1014, and the whole court came back. They traipsed back. But then Ethelred died. So the situation is pretty open at this stage of things.
Okay.
His son, Edmund Ironside, was a good fighter, and Edmund fought the Danes. And by this time it was Svein's son Knut, and we've all heard of Knut, holding back the tide story and all that. We've all heard of Knut. Well, Knut admired this young man for his fighting. The fighting finally ended. Both of them were still alive, and they made a deal. And if only Edmund had survived. Edmund was allowed to keep Wessex, the western Saxon lands, the homeland of the Saxons, whereas Knut was going to take over the rest of England. But some disgruntled person murdered the Saxon, murdered Edmund Ironside.
Okay.
So Knut, now we have Knut, king of the whole shebang, and really no viable
opposition.
Yeah, they couldn't get through to him. He turned out to be a good king, as a matter of fact. England prospered under him. A year after he had taken over, he married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred the Unready. So we think of Ethelred now as gone, dead and buried, out of the picture. But wait, we're going to see him again before the story ends. Yes, so Knut was a much more refined type person. And I want to give you one more free sample of Old English here.
You do have to translate,
I will. Well, I didn't translate word for word in the other one. If we have time, I'll do that. But the Knut song here, this is a shorty. And this is from that very time. Meria sungen de monniches binnen Eli. Tha Knut ging ruw derby. Rodeth knichtes nor the land. And here away this monniches sang. It's pretty, actually. It's merrily sang the monks with Ely. Ely was a huge religious installation, which was flattened by William the Conqueror. He wasn't so nice. But so they're out there in East Anglia, which is it's water, a lot of marshes and things, going along in a boat. It merrily sung the monks inside Ely. They could hear it over the water. It must have sounded pretty. When Knut, the king, came rowing by, Rue. And then he says, this is Knut speaking, row, fellows, row, boys or whatever, nearer the land, nor the land, and head away, this Monica sang, and let us listen to the monk's song. So he was cut from different cloth than Ethelred was. And contrary to expectations, he and Emma got along beautifully. And she continued working, stayed. Emma had only 2 children with Ethelred. They were both, one was a boy and one was a girl. And she had 3 with Knut, 2 boys and a girl. And they eventually well, I'll get to that when I get to it. But they ruled England. Now I want to look at a couple more pictures. Let's go on with picture number 7, please. This is the only thing I could find that even purported to show Sven Forkbeard. And you can't see the forked beard because he's wearing the armor. But this presumably comes out of 100 or 200 years later, one of these history compendiums that they made up. Next picture will show, oh, that's the other one. It somehow got out of order. That's the one where they're fleeing to cross the channel. That's poor Ethelred. And people go kneeling to him, showing he is the king and he can call the tune. Next picture, please. This is the only other one I could find of Svein. And no, I'm sorry, this isn't Svein, this is Knut. I did find one other of Svein, but not any good. This is Knut, and it looks like Knut is an older person. He didn't live to be very, very, very old, but such as it is, there he is, and he's wearing the crown and showing that he is king. And it's interesting to me that there's that, looks like the sign of the French, see, like the logo there. But on to the next picture, please. And this obviously is something of a later date, but made in the style, somewhat, the clothing and whatnot of that period. This represents, well, and the interesting part about it is that it gives Emma, this is Emma, both of Emma's names. It says Elgifu, and then Emma, Regina, and she has her 2 crowns. So, and one more picture again. I think there's just one more of her. Oh, there she is with the 2 little boys that she had with Knut. And that's a nice picture. And again, it is undoubtedly done later than that very early thing. But you remember the first picture we looked at, that sort of sketch-like of Emma, is probably more like it. But this is what she would have looked like, probably. There is another little bit on her. So next picture. That, unfortunately, you can't see clearly, but this represents her, and she's on the left, and Knut is on the right, and they are dedicating a cross to the church, which shows you that the days of the thundering are gone. Of course, the vicious raids have stopped. It doesn't mean that the Danish weren't acting up in England, but when you had a Danish king running the place and wanting to keep order. So I think that's rather a nice picture, in fact, and that's an earlier one. That's sort of sketch-like, not filled in so much, is from that. And I don't know, is there one? There may be one more on them. One more, please. No, we'll leave him till last. So, in the fullness of time, then, in 1035, Knut dies. Emma lives on. She lived on for another couple decades. And his son was named Harald Hardrada. And there was another boy that was left over from the previous regime, Harald Harfoot. And they each became king for a couple of years, over the next 5 years or so. And when the last one of those 2 died, in 1042, here's this mighty Danish line is out, and the mighty Saxon line is apparently out. But wait, somebody realizes that the first son of Emma and Ethelred the Unready is over there in France, having been in exile, so they get him back. And he comes thundering back and becomes Edward the Confessor. Now, on the one hand, he had no children, and the story there is that he was too pious to ever consummate his marriage.
Oh.
I don't know if that's true or false. His queen was a Saxon queen, and she was a very active lady, so who knows. But the other thing about it was that he instantly demoted his mother. He took away all of her property, all of her influence. So he wasn't terribly religious, you can see, if he did that to anybody,
Right.
let alone his mother. But he stayed king for, well, from 1042 to 1066. And it was early in that year that the king died. He died in January. And he had allegedly made a deal, a couple of his courtiers, with William of Normandy, saying, you can be king when he dies. So, of course, William of Normandy expected that. Meanwhile, in Norway, there's another Harald up there who thinks he has the best call to the throne.
Okay, in the next 2 minutes now.
In the next
Let's
2
get
minutes.
this wound up.
All right, well, I think we can do that.
So we have Norway and Normandy fighting over who's going to be king.
We do. And if it hadn't been for the Norwegians coming over, and we had a mention of this before in one of our talks, they came over to grab the crown, but the English got up there. This Harold of Wessex, who was just briefly king, got up there and defeated them, but exhausted himself and his army. And by the time they got down there, the Normans were landing, and there was the end of that. So Ethelred the Unready was not unready, but he was ill-advised, and his own judgment seems to have been rather poor. But he did have some influence as king, of course, and he lived in this really turbulent atmosphere. But with all the religious doings that went on there, and these sermons I gave you a sample of, where they really scared people. The Danish didn't scare them enough, they had to scare them even more, with the thought of the afterworld. But Canute was a good king, and that story about the claiming he could hold back the tide was not true, because that is actually in somebody's chronicle, that what he said was, people had been urging him to do more, and he said, well, I'm doing all I can. Do you think I can hold back the tides? Mm-hmm. I'm not God, I can't do that, which was the basis of that story. It makes a wonderful story.
Oh, it does. It does.
But you see a really colorful picture, and Ethelred, who's gone down in history as Ethelred the Unready, many jokes, T-shirts and everything. If you're unready, you must be named Ethelred, that kind of thing. Oh, but an interesting glance into a really, really convoluted little period.
It's interesting to look at that period of history, that it was so unsettled, mm-hmm. and then look at today and see how unsettled things are today, basically for the same reason, who's in charge.
Yeah.
And
people have sort of been calling Obama the Unready, because he wouldn't take violent action or anything.
It's interesting to look at history in comparison with what's going on today. We don't seem to have learned very much.
Not much.
Okay, thank you so much, Jane. I hope we all followed along with all that little ins and outs of the history, and can see that people are people regardless of whether it was 1,000 years ago or today. Let's look and see what our programs are coming up.